When the First World War began, everything was about to change, and the cigarette was no exception. Before 1914, the cigarette was considered the vice of the underclass, of criminals, foreigners, outcasts, and rogues. It was seen as a blight on the health of the average American and a harbinger of the collapse of the Republic. But when the war ended 4 years later, the cigarette suddenly exploded in popularity. No longer was its smoker a pariah, but a patriot. How did this happen? How did the cigarette go from nothing to a titan of the world? It has everything to do with war. It's the story of how the world's militaries briefly became the largest cartels in the world, addicting millions of soldiers and sending them back home to spread their habits. It's how advertisers exploited that fact and how the United States sold the cigarette to a world ravaged by conflict. This is the story of how war made the cigarette. But first, this video is made possible by Delete Me, a data privacy company that makes removing your personal information from the internet as simple and easy as possible. If you don't live in a country that's protected by European data regulations, your data has likely been vacuumed up by data brokers and is being sold to third parties for profit. Usually they use that data to target you with specific ads, but the same data can also be used to discriminate against you when applying for health insurance or when being offered a job. Basically, out there right now is a profile on you that any company can pay to see. This data can also be used by fraudsters and criminals if any data broker is hit by a leak, which means that your personal information suddenly becomes a valuable tool in the arsenal of somebody trying to scam, defraud, or impersonate you. Delete Me believes in the right to privacy and the right to removal, and they make removing this information from the internet a lot easier. With just a few clicks, you're ready to go. Unlike other companies, Delete Me's sole focus is removing your personal information from the internet, so their services are a lot more targeted and effective. Get 20% off Delete Me US's consumer plans when you go to www.joindeleteme.com/imperial and use the promo code Imperial at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/imperial. Anyway, that's all. Let's get back to the video. Society in the late 18 and early 1900s was not particularly fond of the cigarette. It was a mysterious novelty that most were ignorant of, and in the dim light of ignorance is born fear and prejudice. In Great Britain, cigarettes were linked with a lack of manliness and effeminacy. In the United States, it was associated with immoral miscreants up to no good, or criminals, or foreigners whose customs may as well have been alien as far as the American middle class was concerned. Reflecting that mood, one particularly alarmist 1886 New York Times article wrote that, quote, "The decadence of Spain began when the Spaniards adopted cigarettes. And if this pernicious practice obtains among adult Americans, the ruin of the Republic is close at hand." Influential Americans such as Henry Ford also railed against the cigarette. In this 1914 pamphlet, he argues that if you study the history of almost any criminal, you will find that he is an inveterate cigarette smoker. Early health reformers too criticized the product on the basis that it was unhealthy and that it threatened to enfeeble an entire generation of young Americans who were seen to smoke it disproportionately. Temperance activists likened the cigarette vice to that of alcohol and its destructive side effects, creating the unenviable association with a product that would soon be outlawed in the entire country under prohibition. But of course, the cigarette never met that fate. Between 1895 and 1921, 15 states banned cigarette sales, but those bans were short-lived. By 1927, they had all been repealed. In fact, in the face of all that opposition, between 1900 and 1920, per capita consumption saw an increase of more than 1,000%. The war against the cigarette never reached the same heights as the war against alcohol. Another conflict rudely derailed it before it could reach its peak. The First World War. The First World War caused a massive uptick in cigarette consumption in most participating countries. In the United Kingdom, consumption of the cigarette nearly doubled between 1914 and 1920, coming to represent the majority of tobacco sales. In France too, cigarette sales rose from 3.7 to 4.9 billion from 1913 to 1919, a 31% increase in 6 years. A year before war broke out in 1914, Germany produced roughly 13 billion cigarettes. When records became available again in 1925, they were producing 30.5 billion. The US was no exception. Its per capita consumption rates more than doubled between 1915 and 1920. Some estimates say it tripled. A significant cause of this increase was the popularity of cigarettes among soldiers. They were included in the rations of US, British, French and German servicemen as a means of improving morale in the trenches. It was recognized early on that the nicotine present in a cigarette was an effective means of calming the nerves of soldiers, who were inescapably surrounded in every waking moment by all manner of calamity and catastrophe. The cigarette was a solace in a sea of mayhem, a slim white and brown soldier standing rank and file in a trench-like box of its own, helping to wash away the misery of war. So militaries became drug dealers, addicting their soldiers to cigarettes, hoping to keep spirits high. Reflecting the importance the US Army placed on smoking, General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, stated, "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer tobacco as much as bullets. Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration. We must have thousands of tons without delay." The British Minister of Food, David Thomas, also sang its praises. He said, "Our men would eat a great deal more if they did not have tobacco," acknowledging that smoking reduced the appetite, and thus lowered the amount of food required by the average soldier. The cigarette just happened to be the most effective vehicle for the delivery of tobacco and nicotine. Small and compact, it was the natural choice over cigars or pipes in a logistics calculus. This, along with psychological and physiological effects that were deemed beneficial in wartime, meant it suddenly became a product very much in vogue. Indeed, even former temperance activists who had opposed cigarettes just prior to the war had suddenly changed their tunes. The Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, a formerly ardent opponent of smoking, whose founder stated cigarettes were, quote, a growing evil, was now actively handing them out to soldiers on the front lines and in military canteens. What was the rationale behind this change of heart? Well, smoking cigarettes was seen as relatively less harmful compared with the likes of alcoholism, prostitution, harder drugs and gambling. The YMCA reasoned that cigarettes could be used to keep soldiers away from these more sinister activities. As for the concerns about health, well, denying cigarettes to soldiers on the basis of health risks seemed rather ridiculous considering they stood amidst shell and shrapnel day after day on the front. One YMCA member explained the absurdity of the matter in a brutal fashion. Hundreds of thousands of men in the trenches would go mad or at least become so nervously inefficient as to be useless if tobacco were denied them. Many a sorely wounded lad has died with a cigarette in his mouth, whose dying was less bitter because of the poison pill. The argument that tobacco may shorten the life 5 or 10 years and that it dulls the brain in the meantime seems a little out of place in a trench where men stand in frozen blood and water and wait for death. While the cigarette helped soften the tedium and trauma of life in the trenches, it addicted hundreds of thousands of men to a harmful stimulant that they did not need during peacetime. World War I did eventually end, and when it did, the US Army sent home a new generation of addicts it had made dependent on the cigarette. And like clockwork, the Western world's markets smelled an opportunity to sell more product. Benedict Crowell, the Assistant Director of War Munitions in the United States, estimated that 95% of all American soldiers used tobacco in one form or another during the war. Cigarette companies were aware of this, and they were eager to capture these potential new customers as soon as they came home from service abroad. The cigarette manufacturer Chesterfield released this set of adverts in January of 1919, just 2 months after the end of hostilities in Europe. They depicted servicemen from the Air Force, Navy, and military puffing away at a mild Chesterfield, creating an explicit association between the cigarette and the soldier. In doing so, they managed to make smoking patriotic. Where once cigarettes were lumped together with America's ills and immorality, they were now associated with far more positive values: freedom, democracy, and modernity. War had just popularized the cigarette. Just as importantly, the war and these ads disrupted the perception of the cigarette as an effeminate vice meant mainly for, quote, boys and women, as one 1884 New York Times article put it. Prior to the First World War, the pipe was seen as the manliest means of consuming tobacco, but now the cigarette had taken its place. By becoming the soldier's habit, it had transformed itself into the quintessential symbol of American masculinity. But it wasn't just in the United States that the cigarette became associated with war and patriotism. In March of 1917, the British tobacco manufacturer Wills released a set of 24 cards included in their cigarette packs. Each card depicted servicemen from different branches of the military and, on occasion, the less famous supporting casts of the war. A masterstroke of marketing, this connected cigarettes with the bravery and sacrifice of the average person toiling away in the machine of war, whether they be on the front lines or in the factory. Every drag and puff of a Wills cigarette was henceforth imbued with patriotic fervour. Another clever element of including cigarette cards, although Wills definitely weren't the first to do so, was that it encouraged smokers to buy more packs until they completed the full set of 24. It gamified the addiction. Despite these innovative tactics, cigarette advertising and the cigarette industry itself was still in its infancy at the time. In many ways, World War I was just the beginning. The Second World War was when the cigarette really turned on its afterburners. The impact of World War II on the popularity of cigarettes seems obvious. One only needs to look at this graph. It shows an increase in the US from roughly 1,800 cigarettes in per capita consumption in the year 1939 to nearly double that in 1945. We should, however, be careful not to conflate correlation with causation. The cigarette industry, as historian Richard Tennant outlines, experienced consistent growth throughout the decades between World War I and II, and was only hampered by external events such as the Great Depression. That is to say, the cigarette looked to be on an upward trend even before World War II. That trend would have likely continued even in the absence of the conflict as industrialization ramped up and the increasing convenience and fashionableness of the cigarette grew as well. The Second World War, although not essential to the success of the cigarette, transformed its tempered rise into a meteoric one. During World War I, a mere total of 7.5 billion cigarettes were shipped abroad for military use. That number had skyrocketed to 92 billion per year in World War II. The number of cigarettes being consumed by the average American soldier was so high that one December 1944 defense report wrote that, quote, 30% of the total available supply of cigarettes is going to our armed forces overseas. This, coupled with a sharp increase in civilian demand for cigarettes, led to a cigarette famine, ultimately resulting in hoarding and panic buying. This prompted the American cigarette industry to go into overdrive to keep up, pumping out a quantity of cigarettes once thought unfathomable. Yearly output climbed from 172.5 billion in 1939 to 267.6 billion in 1945, an increase of 55% over 6 years. Even more than in the First World War, cigarette marketing became associated with wartime patriotism and sacrifice. Adverts like this one encouraged the reader to buy cigarettes and war bonds in support of the war effort, as if trying to conflate the two as similarly patriotic acts. Ad campaigns also started targeting women who had been drafted in droves into the US's war support industry. This advertisement in a November 1944 edition of Vogue depicted 4 women, each in different war-related vocations, praising Camel cigarettes as their smoke of choice. With so many women in the war, as with so many men, their cigarette is Camel. Cigarette manufacturers also began encouraging women to buy gifts for their husbands or boyfriends in the military, as if the number of free cigarettes included in the rations of every soldier wasn't enough. 2 of the largest brands, Camel and Chesterfield's, both published advertisements promoting the practice, each trying to convince female buyers that their product was the most savoured smoke in the service, and that they should send them off as gifts overseas, sometimes by the carton. Another war-related marketing ploy saw the cigarette company Lucky Strike claim to have swapped out their old branding colours, green and red, for a new red and white look because green contained copper, a metal increasingly needed for war manufacturing. They painted this shift as a patriotic move of self-sacrifice, initiating a marketing campaign with the tagline, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." In actuality, the green they used contained chromium, not copper, and Lucky Strike had known their existing colour scheme to be unpopular for some time. In the 1940s, sleek and minimalistic branding was gaining popularity, and Lucky Strike likely planned to change its packaging colours regardless of World War II. The US joining the war was probably just a fortuitous opportunity to link their product to the armed forces and patriotism. To further drive home the association between Lucky Strikes and the military, they included "Lucky Strike means fine tobacco," rendered in a style similar to Morse code, next to the packaging in its adverts. This sort of aggressive marketing wasn't present everywhere. In Germany, cigarette advertisements were heavily restricted. The Nazi Party trumpeted anti-smoking rhetoric and banned public smoking in a number of places on the basis of public hygiene and social purity. Despite this, cigarettes were declared a war-important product under their government. Much like in the US during World War I, moral and health reservations about the cigarette were relegated in favour of their benefits as wartime morale boosters. In 1941, Josef Goebbels, head of Germany's propaganda ministry, blocked attempts at instituting a campaign against smoking during the war, citing the fact that millions of soldiers were currently provided cigarettes by the state for use on the front. Despite this, the Nazi Party's position was generally that of opposition to smoking, even if in practice they were somewhat flexible. And this would have a pernicious legacy. As a result of the Nazi aversion to the cigarette and their public criticism of the practice, post-war anti-smoking efforts became conflated with the authoritarianism of Nazi Germany. Pro-tobacco cigarette activists and marketers were quick to label public health campaigns against the cigarette as fascistic throwbacks to the Nazi era. This is theorized to have led to an increase in German cigarette consumption in the post-war period, as health efforts against tobacco were stigmatized. Elsewhere in Europe, the cigarette became more commonplace too. Under the Marshall Plan, a relief program designed to boost capitalist democracies and impede Soviet communism, 4.4% of all products shipped to Europe were tobacco-based between 1948 and 1951. One Virginia congressman, John W. Flanagan, a longtime industry advocate and lawmaker on account of his state being a large tobacco producer, argued that the distribution of the product would, quote, aid in eliminating or retarding the spread of ideologies antagonistic to democracy and to world peace. This, however, happened to be a great boon for the US tobacco industry, who, in their attempts to meet demands, overshot them and now had plenty of product lying around with few buyers in sight. Luckily for them, the US government was here to save the day. It bought excess supply and sent it off to Europe for free, hoping luxury goods such as tobacco would soften austere standards of living and restart the European economy. The flooding of American tobacco into the European market had its adverse effects, though. It undercut domestic manufacturing, most drastically in Greece, which saw one of its backbone industries threatened by cheap, subsidized tobacco. When Greece protested, the ECA, the organization tasked with carrying out the Marshall Plan, stated they were unable to make any accommodations due to pressure from the southern tobacco lobby. Aside from that, the influx of this tobacco also helped reinforce a post-war culture of smoking the cigarette, as many governments came to rely on taxing it as a major source of their income. Between 1945 and the late 1980s, the cigarette came to represent around 80% of the world's tobacco consumption. While it has seen a decline in the United States since then, Europe remains to this day in the thrall of the little white and brown stick. While we may never know what the cigarette's growth would have looked like in the absence of two gigantic 20th century conflicts, we can say with a high degree of certainty that they certainly boosted its popularity. Many militaries in both World War I and II included cigarettes in the basic rations they gave to soldiers, from the Japanese to the Americans, the British to the Germans. The army became an incubator all around the world for the smoking habit, addicting generations of soldiers and releasing them into the world upon war's end, only to get their friends, families, and loved ones hooked on the stuff. In the process, the cigarette became socially acceptable, even patriotic, a fact advertisers exploited. After all, how could the cigarette be so bad if it helped the soldier fight against evil? Smoking during conflict became above all a tribal act, a signifier of conformity and solidarity, and a means by which to bond in difficult times. That culture was brought into peacetime as well. Being a cigarette smoker gave you credentials, made you part of an in-group. It was a means of unspoken social assimilation that spread all over the world. World War II specifically had some unforeseen consequences in Europe. The victorious United States intentionally helped to reinforce the cigarette habit through the likes of the Marshall Plan. Germany's defeat led to its population's rejection of fascism and anything even remotely resembling it. It just so happened that the Nazis weren't fans of the cigarette, and as a result, opposition to smoking acquired a burdensome association with authoritarianism, helping it grow unopposed in Germany. Finally, both world wars led to an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, opening new markets and facilitating an intercontinental cigarette trade that was primed to spread the habit and its myriad health risks all over the world. The cigarette burned brightest in the twilight of war, but it still burns on today, dragging the hand that smokes it to an early grave.